Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you are watching this third and final webinar as we prepare for Monday. And again, I fully apologize that I didn't get this to the group sooner. So if you don't have a chance to watch it before Monday, certainly you've got it in hand, perhaps at the end of the day Monday or just in the future. But I'm going to kind of highlight what we're going to kind of tackle on days 3 and 4, in addition to continuing the work we've done on steps 1, 2, 3. We skip step 4. And then 5, 6, and 7. So I'm going to jump right in. One thing I want to mention is that all of your assessments are always a work in progress. They're always going to be in a draft form. And certainly we want to do our best to make them as tight and concise before we put them in front of students and use them to make adjustments. But there's always going to be that time where we have to acknowledge that they're never completed. So getting it started is more important than getting it right. So one of the things we're going to talk about early in the day on Monday is the highway of aligned assessments. And if you look here, these were the things that we've talked a lot about. We prioritized, unwrapped big ideas and essential questions, and created our post and pre-CFA. What you see in red, those larger circles, that's what we're going to do on days 3 and 4. Develop learning intentions, success criteria, and then learning progressions with progress checks. Then throughout the unit, we might determine approximately 2 or 3 times when we're going to do a progress check and identify some of the learning progressions that students will need to develop through to be successful by the end of the unit. And the pre-CFA should align with the post-CFA in that when we look at our pre-CFA results, that will help us set goals and strategies along the way, and we're constantly interpreting and adjusting. We'll need to determine is when does the team do a mid-team unit check-in? We're going to say this is a good approximate date. We're going to look where the students are, and maybe there's a quiz in the middle, or maybe there's some other, what I'm going to share, progress check evidence to determine are students progressing where we would need them to be towards the end of the unit. And then, of course, when we have the end of the unit, we're going to have our post-CFA and determine where they're at then and plan for the bridge instruction. Now, what I mean by the bridge is that time between units, when we might need more time to intervene and reteach. That's why it's going to be critical for that mid-team unit check-in to determine how much time might we need from one unit to the next. And I think what will happen then is we'll be looking at it from a science background. What are those overarching concepts and skills that we know we're going to recycle multiple times that we could catch them on the next one? And what might be something we say, no, we're going to need to really be intentional early on so that way if they don't get it, we might not be continuing to struggle along the way. And I think that's where the PLC power can come into play. And certainly we'll talk about how this can be used in some of our singleton settings. But I've kind of slimmed it down here in a very simple version. We have our pre, we have our post, learning intention, success criteria, with our quick progress checks for each learning progression as we interpret and adjust. And so this previous example, you're going to see it in the manual, see on page 24. We're actually going to do a couple activities with it. It's a chance for us to simplify it, though, and realize we're going from pre to post and looking at what are some of those progress checks along the way to know if students are reaching where we want them to. So now we're going to talk about the steps that we're going to address on days 3 and 4. Step 4, 8, 9, and 10. Learning progressions, intentions as student success criteria. Before that, we're going to spend some time looking at how we build the highway. All the pieces that come into play from our standards, from our assessments, the curriculum, instruction. I've kind of highlighted data analysis because far too often I think we confuse data with evidence. Evidence is a form of data, and evidence is exit tickets that identify if students are identifying the variable. They're short 2-question quizzes that we are identifying if they get it or not, and it doesn't have to be large spreadsheets of numbers and percentages. So we're going to do an activity with some cards, and it's really powerful, where we move them around and say, how do we identify each of these critical steps and develop and build that highway, which might look different for those of us that are in singleton settings than those of us that are in large settings. The parts will all be there, but how we view them might be a little bit different in our conceptual understanding. So then I think for some of us, when we get into step 4, it's going to be kind of similar to things we've done before when we talk about learning intentions. Learning intentions are what we as the teacher want the students to learn in terms of the knowledge and skills within any particular unit or lesson. It's for us. But what's critical is that students understand success criteria. And so we're going to talk about how what we've already done with the unwrapping can drive our success criteria. This is just one simple example that I've used similar from the template where standard was unwrapped, but then it was augmented. So students will be able to distinguish dominant and recessive. I, as a student, will have to determine phenotype and genotype, describe the following terms, illustrate inheritance over multiple generations. I'm going to break that down so the students understand how they'll know if they are successful. And then we'll talk a little bit about what is the core unit vocabulary. And what I've noted here, this is my particular assessment I worked on, terms with the asterisks are vocabulary that aren't even listed in the standard, but they're foundational to the unit. So we'll say all of these terms are kind of important, but there's a few that, for this unit, they're kind of the biggies. And that might drive how we teach, how we assess, and maybe look differently at maybe some of our vocabulary quizzes and how students are, even using note cards and things to apply where we're really stressing certain terminology more than others. And I think all of us know it's very easy to get caught up, especially in science, with all the terminology that they need to possibly grasp versus the core vocabulary that they absolutely must have a solid understanding of. We're then going to get into probably what's new for some of us, determining learning progressions and an instructional sequence. We've thought about an instructional sequence before, but that was probably based on activities and lessons and tasks, less about learning progressions. And it's a missing link. And I can say most of us, in fact, all of us, with our exception, have deep course learning and prerequisite learning in college and undergrad and graduate on learning, not teaching, but learning. And so we're going to talk about what are those core learning progressions. And I'm just going to highlight one example here, why this will be important. Because as we develop our set of learning progressions that students would need to progress through, we can check for what is some knowledge and a sub-skill that's even prior to what's even in some of our unwrapping, which will help us drive, as this comes from James Popham, some guidance. Teachers often wonder, when should I move on? When should I move on in the curriculum, in the unit, in the instruction? Well, here's some guidelines. And certainly that 80% is relative, but if we have several sub-skills and some knowledge that we know they need to have, for example, for them to be able to effectively write their conduct their experiment, they're going to have to understand some cause and effect relationships. When we see 80% of the students getting it most of the time, that's a good chance to move on. Later in the unit, when things are becoming a little bit tighter, we might be a little bit more around the 90%. And again, it's a guide, but I think teachers will see this could be a great place where we determine how and when we move on. And I'm going to go back to this little graph here, those quick progress checks. What we mean by those are the things that we should be using in our PLC settings, the things we should be using in our collaborative discussions, or as a teacher that I should be looking for in the student work, not the student work completed. So I'll just show you one example. This is something we will do. We will develop our sub-skills from our success criteria. So for students to develop a model, they have to identify atoms. They have to diagram the location of a subatomic particle. And our progress check might be an exit ticket where they have to list 3 main parts of an atom and identify their charge. They're given a certain element to draw an accurate model of the atomic structure. When we describe the atomic composition of simple molecules, they might have to identify molecules are made of 2 or more atoms and model chemical forms represent 3D structures. And then given an example, it's a little bit hard to see from this chart, to identify an atom and its molecule and then correctly define it. And again, I've got many examples like this, but this is where we're going to really determine what would students need to be able to do. So for example, this just last one, if they're going to plan an investigation, they have to understand the parts of an investigation. So what we wouldn't want to say that our quick progress check is an exit ticket. We would say that on the exit ticket, students will be asked to provide a list of parts of an effective investigation, and we might say, okay, they need to have at least 4 of our 6 or 5 of our 7 or whatever that is. So we're going to talk about how we would come together and go, what would be enough demonstration of evidence that we could look for in the day-to-day, over 2 or 3 days of student work, which might guide how we use the student work students do, and it might get us to grade less. Because this isn't about grading, it's about monitoring the learning. And it really might empower us to be a little bit more judicious with the precious time we have in instruction and assessment. And again, sometimes grading can get in the way of that. Again, didn't expect anyone to have to watch that before we come into days 1 and 2, and certainly I don't expect us to walk away kind of having a full understanding, but it might be a nice precursor to watch before Monday, or even between Monday and Tuesday, or at least to have afterwards as we think about these steps that we're going to go through when we complete days 3 and 4. Appreciate so much you're watching this webinar or any of the other 2, and I still look forward to seeing everybody on Monday. Have a safe trip into Pierre, and we'll talk to you then.